The hospital room, lit by the cold glow of fluorescent lights, felt more like a holding chamber for fading breath than a place for healing. Machines hummed low and constant, a synthetic lullaby that no one wanted to hear. The snow fell outside the wide window of room 214 in soft, unbroken sheets, blanketing the Montana horizon in silence. Inside, Sailor Dorn lay still beneath pale blue hospital sheets, her skin nearly matching them in color. The 7-year-old girl hadn't spoken in days. Her once vivid green eyes no longer followed voices or light. They only stared vaguely toward the ceiling, lost in a place her mother couldn't reach. Nida sat beside her daughter, with her hand resting gently on the child's frail fingers, as if her touch might anchor her daughter to the world. But Sailor was slipping. Everyone knew it. The doctors had stopped giving timelines. It was no longer a matter of what could be done. It was a question of what might still matter in the end. They whispered the words when Nida wasn't in the room. Palliative comfort measures. Days, maybe hours. Nida had stopped listening to the nurses' voices and started memorizing the sound of her daughter's breath instead. That, at least, was real. The door opened with a soft squeak, but it wasn't another nurse with a clipboard or a new IV bag. Instead, padding quietly across the sterile tile floor, came a figure that didn't belong in the cold landscape of beeping monitors and sanitized despair. A black-saddled German Shepherd pup, not more than 8 months old, moved with the strange composure of something older than its age. He was dark as midnight, save for the soft caramel markings on his legs and muzzle. His eyes were a warm, unreadable brown that seemed almost out of place in this room, designed to erase personality. Jasper. He had been scheduled for visitation with pediatric patients as part of the hospital's emotional support program. But what happened next was not part of any protocol. He didn't hesitate at the door or wait for a command. He walked straight to the bed, climbed carefully onto the mattress with the unshakable grace of someone who knew they belonged there, and lowered his head onto Sailor's motionless arm. Then, as if directed by something unseen, he raised his paw and placed it gently atop her pale open hand. Nothing happened for a heartbeat, then another, and then, in the third still moment, Sailor's fingers twitched. At first, it was so small that Nida thought she imagined it, but it happened again. The faintest curl of her daughter's hand around the soft fur of the pup's paw, a breath caught in Nida's throat. A sound, soft and scratchy and almost too weak to be heard, broke the sterile silence. "You really came." The words came from Sailor, not imagined, not a ghost of memory, but real. Her voice, the heart monitor, registered a change, the erratic rhythm suddenly smoothing as if the machine itself had been waiting for something more human to respond to. Nida gasped, half laughing and half sobbing as she leaned forward, searching her daughter's face for another sign that this wasn't a dream. Outside the door, Nurse Soraya Lang stood frozen, her hands still gripping the medication tray she had been carrying. Her breath had hitched when she saw the dog approach the bed, but she couldn't move now. What she was witnessing didn't feel like medicine or science. It felt like a moment suspended in time, as if something sacred had entered the room without being invited and without needing permission. Dr. Evander Rowe, the attending neurologist, saw the sudden spike in oxygen saturation and heart rhythm from the hallway monitor and rushed in. His shoes squeaked on the tile, but no one looked at him. All eyes remained on the girl and the dog. His gaze darted from the screen to the child, then back to the dog who hadn't moved since placing his paw on her hand. "Her vitals are stabilizing," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He approached slowly, cautiously, like he was afraid that speaking too loudly might undo what had just begun. Jasper looked up at him briefly, then returned his attention to Sailor, his head still resting gently against her chest. The pup didn't wag his tail, didn't move or make a sound. He simply stayed there, calm and constant. And for the first time in weeks, Sailor's breathing matched the machine's rhythm. That night, for the first time since her decline began, she didn't moan in her sleep. She didn't flinch or cry out from invisible pain. She rested, and Jasper never left her side. The hospital had never allowed overnight animal visits, but that night, The head nurse signed the form herself and told security to forget they saw anything. The staff didn't question the decision. Something in the air of room 214 had changed, and everyone felt it. By morning, it wasn't just Sailor who was different. The room itself felt warmer, somehow less like a place waiting for death, and more like a place where something precious was, being guarded. When Dr. Rowe returned with a team of specialists and fresh labs, he was greeted not by the child they had nearly said goodbye to, but by a little girl sitting upright against her pillows, her thin frame weak but steady, her hand resting quietly in Jasper's fur. She was smiling. "I want applesauce," she said. 3 simple words. And yet, when they left her lips, it was like the entire room took its first breath in days. The staff didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their glances to one another said enough. No one knew exactly what had happened in that room. There was no diagnosis code for what had passed between the girl and the dog. No treatment plan that involved a puppy pressing his paw against a dying child's hand. But the proof was undeniable. Something had shifted, and it had started the moment Jasper walked into that room. For the first time in the hospital's long and strictly regulated history, a dog was granted overnight presence in a patient's room. Not just any room, but room 214. The one nurses had quietly started calling the quiet light since yesterday's unexplainable turn. When the shift changed and Soraya Lang handed over the chart, her fingers lingered for a moment longer on the clipboard, as if the ink written on those pages held something sacred. Jasper hadn't moved all night, pressed gently against Sailor's side, matching his breath with the girl's in some unknowable rhythm. No medical monitor recorded it, yet every nurse who peeked through the glass knew something had shifted. By dawn, whispers flowed through the halls like mist. Nurses walked slower past room 214, some pausing longer than necessary, not to observe vitals or machines, but simply to see Jasper lay curled with his head near Sailor's ribs, his eyes half closed yet unblinking, as though guarding the threshold of something unseen. Naida hadn't slept. She sat by the window, wrapped in the scratchy hospital blanket, watching both her daughter and the silent guardian at her side. When the morning light pressed through the half-frozen window, Sailor stirred. It wasn't just a twitch or a reflex. She reached out toward Jasper, fingers curling through his fur. And in a voice barely above breath, she asked for applesauce. Naida startled, nearly dropping the water cup in her lap. She blinked once, then twice, unsure if she'd imagined the words. Sailor looked up at her mother and smiled faintly, as though waking from a long dream she wasn't ready to leave behind. She wasn't ready to leave behind. That afternoon, Sailor sat upright in her bed, not for minutes but hours. She asked questions, made eye contact, and spoke the names of nurses she hadn't recognized for weeks. Dr. Rowe reviewed her scans in stunned silence, flipping between grayscale images of a brain that had once resembled the fading embers of a fire, now relit with unmistakable sparks of activity. Areas once declared inactive showed blood flow, synapses firing again. He stared at the latest MRI longer than necessary, his hand gripping the edge of the light board. Sailor's healing made no medical sense. Not even spontaneous remission would happen this fast, this completely. And yet, when he looked up from the scans and into room 214, Jasper was already watching him. The dark glass of his eyes held something ancient and undecipherable. Later, as the sky darkened and a soft flurry of snow began to dance past the windows, Naida leaned closer to Sailor while brushing the girl's hair away from her face. She tried to ask without sounding afraid, without showing the desperation that had followed her every breath for weeks. "What is he giving you?" she whispered. Sailor didn't hesitate. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "He's holding me here," she said. Naida's breath caught in her chest. There was no metaphor in her daughter's tone, no child's imagination coloring the moment. It was spoken as fact, as pure as snow settling on glass. Naida closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, not just from the weight of hope, but from the gravity of something she didn't understand, something greater than hope. The staff's silence deepened. Nurses no longer made idle conversation near 214. Even Dr. Rowe, pragmatic to a fault, found himself lingering longer at the doorway before entering, as if waiting to be granted access by something beyond hospital clearance. When he asked Soraya to recount what she saw the first night Jasper arrived, her voice faltered not from forgetfulness, but from the reverence of trying to explain something that refused to be defined. It wasn't just improvement, she said finally. It was like the air changed when he touched her, like the walls exhaled. Jasper continued his vigil without demand or disruption. He did not bark, did not beg for food or attention. He simply remained beside Sailor, responding only to her, turning his head at her slightest murmur, nudging her hand when her eyelids drooped for medication, curling tighter when her breath grew thin. Soraya began keeping a second clipboard, not for official records but for her own observations. There she logged when Jasper stood, when his ears twitched, when Sailor responded without prompting. She marked every unexplained drop in fever, every moment of clarity, and though she never spoke of it aloud, she circled one thing over and over in the margins. Room 214 was changing. The hospital never slept. Not really. It hummed softly through the night, alive with the faint rhythm of machines, distant footsteps, and the occasional muffled voices behind closed doors. But after Jasper arrived, something in the air around room 214 shifted. It wasn't anything loud or visible. It was in the stillness, in the way the hallway outside Sailor's room seemed to grow quieter after sundown. How even the overhead lights dimmed without command, as if in reverence. There were whispers among the staff, traded in corners and behind. Medication carts, not quite fear but not disbelief either. Jasper never left Sailor's side at night. He slept curled at the foot of her bed, his breathing rising and falling with hers. But as the nights wore on, his behavior began to change. He stopped sleeping entirely. He began sitting up for hours, posture rigid, ears flicking as if catching sounds no one else could hear, and most disturbingly, he would stare unwavering into the far left corner of the room, the one cloaked in the shadows cast by the monitor light. Nida noticed it first one night. She awoke in her chair to the creak of the bed frame. Sailor was asleep, peaceful. Her small hand curled near Jasper's paw, but the dog wasn't resting. He was upright, gaze fixed on the shadowed corner, muscles coiled like a spring, yet silent. Nida whispered his name, but he didn't respond. His focus was absolute, almost unnerving. The following day, a nurse named Camille entered the room for a routine vitals check. She was young, new to the rotation, unprepared for the heavy hush that had settled there. She paused mid-step, glancing toward the corner where Jasper had stared the night before, then turned to Sailor with a forced smile. But the child, now propped up on pillows and more alert than anyone had expected, beat her to it. "He doesn't sleep like we do," Sailor said quietly without prompting. Camille blinked, unsure how to respond. Nida turned sharply, unsettled by the odd familiarity in her daughter's tone. Sailor was tracing her fingers through Jasper's thick black fur, her expression unreadable. Later that afternoon, Dr. Rowe returned with a stack of new scans. He'd started keeping his own quiet records, not just of Sailor's neurological progress, but of every instance of Jasper's unusual behavior. He claimed it was for clinical accuracy, but deep down, he knew it was something else. He had watched too many inexplicable changes to believe in coincidence. The latest scans were stunning. Cortical activity was resuming in areas once believed to be functionally silent. Reflex arcs once unresponsive were reacting again. No medication had changed, no external treatment had been added, and still the progress continued. That night, Soraya Lang lingered longer than usual outside room 214. Through the glass, she saw Jasper once again alert, his eyes glinting in the low light. Sailor wasn't asleep yet. She sat cross-legged, sketching with short, deliberate strokes into a journal someone had left her. From the hallway, Soraya watched as the girl stopped suddenly, looked toward the same corner that Jasper always watched, and whispered something inaudible. Jasper didn't react visibly, but Soraya could have sworn the temperature in the hallway dropped. By the end of the week, word of Jasper's stare had spread beyond whispers. One orderly refused to clean room 214 after midnight, claiming the dog had followed him with his eyes the entire time even when turned away. Another nurse said she walked past the room during rounds and saw Jasper's reflection in the window, eyes glowing faintly, though the room was lit only by the soft green pulse of the heart monitor. Dr. Rowe began documenting every one of these stories, not to disprove them but to understand them. He cross-referenced each one with Sailor's vital chart, and disturbingly, they aligned. Each time Jasper had an episode of watching, Sailor's vitals would stabilize or show slight improvement. Shortly after, it was as if the dog were doing something more than guarding, as if he were intervening. Sailor became quieter as the week continued, not withdrawn but more internal, as if listening to things no one else could hear. Her drawings turned darker, filled with tall shadows and vague, spindly shapes. And always beside her in every sketch was a figure like Jasper. Not a cartoon dog, but something older, grander, with golden eyes that gleamed like stars through smoke. One morning, Nida found a drawing tucked beneath Sailor's pillow. In it, a tall, dark shape loomed over her daughter's bed, faceless and jagged, but between it and the bed stood Jasper, drawn larger than life, his form tense, eyes glowing, teeth bared. She showed the drawing to Dr. Rowe, and for the first time since the miracle began, he looked afraid. "There's something in the room with her," he murmured. Nida's hands trembled as she folded the drawing, or trying to. That night, when the hospital lights dimmed and the snow thickened outside, Jasper stood at the foot of the bed for hours, unmoving. Sailor was asleep, breathing steady, but the shadows in the far corner stretched longer than they should have, and Jasper didn't blink once. Snow had settled over Montana like a second skin, thick and unmoving, muffling even the sound of footsteps in the parking lot below. The hospital stood silent against the dark sky, its windows glowing faintly under a haze of ice-crusted fog. Inside room 214, a gravity of its own had taken hold. Nurses passed it quickly, sometimes without realizing they'd held their breath. Others slowed, not from duty, but from something unspoken, a weight they couldn't name. The temperature logs had begun to show a recurring anomaly, always colder in that one room, always after midnight. Sailor was awake again, as she had been the past 3 nights, and again Jasper stood rigid at the foot of her bed, eyes trained on the same darkened corner. He had not barked, not growled, but the tension in his body was unmissable. His stillness was not one of calm but of coiled resistance. He watched that corner like a sentry, like something lived there, something only he could see. Nida dozed lightly in the recliner, still bundled in her thick-knit cardigan, her head tilted back, mouth parted slightly from exhaustion. A nurse had tried to offer her a cot 2 nights ago, but she refused. She didn't want to miss anything, not a moment, not a breath. The overhead lights dimmed with a faint buzz. The room's quiet changed in texture, no longer silence but a vacuum, a kind of absence. Sailor shifted in the bed, her small hand clutching the blanket, and without turning her head, she whispered, "It's back." Jasper moved one step, then another. He positioned himself between Sailor and the corner, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep inhale. Then he bared his teeth, just slightly, not in warning but in recognition. The temperature in the room dipped enough for Nida to feel it through the sleeves of her sweater. She crossed her arms over her chest and reached instinctively for her water. The machines beeped in dissonant bursts. Sailor's vitals spiked, heart rate erratic, oxygen dipping. Nida's hand hit the call button out of pure reflex, but no one came immediately. The hallway lights outside room 214 had gone dim. The bulb above Sailor's bed flickered, humming as if overwhelmed. Then with a pop like a snapped wire, it burst. The room was plunged into shadow. The monitors glowed faint green and blue against the walls, casting Jasper in a surreal silhouette. Then he leapt. There was no sound of impact, no physical target. But the force in Jasper's motion was unmistakable. He had charged at something, his body colliding with air, and yet the sound that followed was a guttural snarl ripped from deep in his throat. Sailor screamed, her body arching off the mattress as if some invisible hook had seized her from within. Nida grabbed her, holding her down with both arms, tears streaming. Before she could process what she was doing, she didn't know what was happening, only that it was real, and it was here. Jasper snarled again, this time with such fury that Dr. Rowe, sprinting down the hall, could hear it from 20 feet away. He burst into the room, saw shattered glass, a failed monitor, Sailor writhing, Jasper crouched low and teeth bared at the corner where no one stood. Rowe's eyes moved from child to dog to the corner itself. He felt it then. Not fear, but the sense of being watched, of something ancient and uninvited. Vitals dropping fast, he called out, though no one had yet followed. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, but as he reached for Sailor's wrist, Jasper snarled, snapping inches from his hand. "Back!" Nida cried, shielding Sailor's head. But Rowe didn't move further. He watched, then just as suddenly, the room exhaled. The pressure lifted, the chill faded, the machine steadied, the noise stopped. Jasper stood panting, the fur along his spine soaked in sweat and bristled stiff. A thin line of red marked his left flank, scratches, not deep, but fresh. Rowe stared, stunned. The air, once thick with dread, felt clear again. Sailor whimpered once, then her breathing steadied. She clutched the blanket to her chin and turned, her face into her mother's chest. "He didn't let it take me," she whispered. Jasper climbed back onto the bed without hesitation and lay across her legs like a shield. He didn't look at Rowe, didn't move toward Nida. He simply watched the corner again, eyes narrowed. No one spoke for a long time. The night nurse who entered 20 minutes later would claim the air was still 10 degrees colder than the hallway. No one argued, no one asked questions. Room 214 had crossed into something else, and Jasper, the puppy with eyes too deep to belong to a dog his age, had stood between this world and something else, and whatever it was, it had not passed, not yet. The snow outside the hospital had finally begun to melt, though the air still held its breath in a winter not yet ready to let go. Inside room 214, the silence had changed again. It was no longer the silence of despair, but something dense and waiting, as if the walls themselves were listening. Sailor was awake, not just conscious but aware. Her cheeks carried the faintest flush, her green eyes no longer distant but anchored to the world in front of her. She sat up, thinner than ever, with Jasper curled beside her on the bed, his head resting gently against her hip. "I know its name," she whispered. Nida looked up from the small corner of the room where she had been folding laundry and watching, always watching. Her voice faltered. "What did you say, baby?" Sailor didn't repeat it. She simply looked at Jasper, who lifted his head slowly, as if he already knew what came next. Then the lights flickered just once, but it was enough. Enough to remind them that whatever haunted the space between dreams and waking was still close. Jasper stood not quickly, not with fear but with purpose. He faced the corner of the room, the same one he had watched for nights, and let out a low, measured growl. His body tensed not in panic, but in defense. This time, he wasn't just guarding. He was challenging. Sailor breathed deeply. "If I say it out loud, it can't hide anymore." "Say what, sweetheart?" Nida asked again, stepping closer now, though something inside her begged her to stay still. Sailor leaned forward, her hand on Jasper's back, her voice coming steady, as if guided by something older than her 7 years. She spoke a name, a word Nida had never heard before, syllables sharp and unfamiliar, not of any language she recognized. The moment the name left Sailor's lips, the fluorescent lights above them dimmed to a deep amber hue. Jasper remained motionless, ears forward, gaze locked into the dark. The temperature in the room dropped, but it wasn't the frigid bite of the Montana air. It was a cold that crawled into the bones, a presence that pressed against the lungs. The machines paused, not malfunctioned, but held their digital breath. Then Jasper moved. He leapt from the bed in a single motion, placing himself between Sailor and the shadowed corner, his body arched. He didn't growl this time. He barked, a sharp, thunderous crack that echoed off the walls. And in that instant, something shifted. A pressure lifted. The room held its breath. Dr. Rowe had been just outside, reviewing her latest scans, which showed inexplicable neurological regeneration, when he heard the sound. He entered without knocking. Jasper stood still now, panting, slightly, his eyes still locked into nothing that could be seen. Sailor lay back, her chest rising steadily, her face calm. Nida didn't speak. Neither did the doctor. The machines resumed as if Jasper's bark had shaken the room free of something that had never belonged. Roe approached slowly, his voice barely audible. "Sailor, what just happened?" She turned her gaze toward him, serene. "He made it leave," she said. Nida let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Are you sure?" Sailor nodded. Jasper returned to the bed, not with his usual slow grace but urgently, placing his entire body across her legs again like a weighted shield. He blinked slowly, then closed his eyes, but never truly slept. Later that night, Dr. Rowe stood at the far end of the hallway, watching the security footage. The cameras showed only the room, a dog barking into a corner, a girl speaking, the lights dimming, no dark shape, no shadow, no movement visible to the eye. But still, he knew something had been there. He returned to the room before dawn. The air inside was lighter. Jasper stirred but did not rise. Sailor was asleep, peaceful. One hand curled around the dog's ear. Rowe whispered to himself a sentence he had resisted for days. "I don't know what you are, Jasper, but you were sent here." By the end of the week, Sailor was cleared for discharge. The final scan showed stabilized vitals, cellular regeneration, and no signs of the deterioration that had once drawn her toward the brink. Nurses lined the corridor as she walked out, one small step at a time. Jasper at her side. None of them said the word miracle. They didn't need to. Outside, the snow had melted into soft puddles across the sidewalk. The sun returned to cast long gold shadows through the trees. Sailor paused before stepping into the car, her coat zipped to her chin, a small knitted hat covering her still thin hair. She looked up at her mother, then down at Jasper. "I get to live," she said, "because he stayed." And Jasper, with all the quiet dignity of a sentinel, simply walked beside her, his presence no longer a question of comfort, but a vow. The hospital doors closed behind them, but for room 214, something had changed forever. And somewhere just beyond the reach of science, the soul of a little girl had been guarded and returned because love had teeth, and it knew how to stand.